identity, place of residence, and occupation were no less significant elements of the argument put forth by José Manuel. Either born free or either born as a free person in Benguela or elsewhere, José Manuel was a part-time soldier in the local Henrique's regiment. He also periodically traveled into the interior with trade goods, which he exchanged himself for captives. He was a slave trader. Manuel was part of a relatively large contingent of free Creole blacks who, by virtue of their identity, place of residence, and occupations, were also protected from enslavement by the Portuguese colonial administration. Indeed, they were instrumental, these types of individuals, like Nbena and José Manuel, in underpinning Benguela's slave export trade. Yet, in spite of such protection, the cases of José Manuel and Nbena also demonstrate the very insecurity generated by the enslavement process. The very individuals who sustained the slave trade could easily become caught up in its web and be enslaved themselves and quickly deported across the Atlantic world. Moreover, both cases show how the process of enslavement sometimes unfolded over days, weeks, months, and even years. Becoming a slave was not a question of a momentary event. Some victims lived for long periods of time with anguish stemming from their disputed status and dreaded deportation from their homeland. In short, the experiences of José Manuel and Nbena capture well the horror and the terror that accompany the African dimensions of the slave trade, as we will see in a minute. But before turning to the stories of José Manuel and Nbena, we need to take a look at the landscape, the social landscape of Benguela in the 1810s in particular. During this decade, Benguela was the second most important slaving port in Angola, this after Luanda, of course. And overall, in terms of the overall slave trade, Benguela is one of the 4 or 5 most important exporters of slaves across the Atlantic world. A small, quote-unquote, pig town is spewing thousands and thousands and thousands of slaves into the Atlantic world throughout the 18th and indeed into the 19th centuries, as well as before. But during the 1810s, there are something like 45,000 slaves that get shipped out of this port town alone. 85% of the slaves shipped from here end up in another very peculiar landscape on the other side, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. So if you get shipped out as a slave from Benguela, you basically are going to land, if you live through the Middle Passage, you're going to land in Rio, no question about it. However, these 45,000 slaves that are being exported during the 1810s already represent Benguela on the downturn of the slave trade economy. By then, Benguela is already on a downswing and exporting far less than the 84,000 slaves that it has exported during the 1790s. The 1790s is the boom decade for slave exports from here. Now, in September 1816, when Manuel de Abreu de Melo y Alvim, a fellow that is going to be quite prominent in our story, when he assumes the governorship of Benguela and its hinterland, one of his major concerns is to expand the commerce in captives, which has been declining since the 1790s, an important fact to keep in mind. Another one is that the permanent population of Benguela is then overwhelmingly African. Between 1813 and 1819, for example, it averaged about 2,300 individuals. Half were African slaves, and about 44% were free Africans. only about 6% were not Africans, in other words. Many of these free and enslaved Africans were in effect Creoles, locally born individuals who worked as artisans or in commercial or other occupations that directly or indirectly supported the slave trade. Look, if you have something like 5,000-6,000 slaves being shipped out of here every year in the 1810s, and there's only about 2,300 individuals living in the place, everybody's got a bloody foot in the slave trade. Everybody. Including the slaves themselves, by the way. The daily nutritional requirements of Benguela's population, as well as the food required by the hundreds upon hundreds of slaves that were being exported out of this port town, led to frequent food shortages. And thus, for sustenance, Benguela depended largely upon African farmers in the immediate hinterland, farmers like Nbena. Since the white population was quite small, the responsibility for defending the port town fell partly upon its Heinrichs regiment. This was a non-paid militia manned exclusively by free blacks, not whites.